tracking Florence.
Hello from the CBS 47 and Fox 30 Action News Jax First Alert Weather Center. I'm Chief Meteorologist Mike Burrish, along with Ariel Nixon and Corey Sima and Garrett Beatenbaugh to my immediate right here. We're talking Florence today and what looks to be a horrific, potentially horrific storm headed for the East Coast.
And now it's a Category 4 storm. This morning at 5 a.m. it was upgraded to Category 2, then 11 a.m. Category 3, and right at noon we got word that the winds reach 130 miles per hour, now Category 4, major hurricane.
And this hurricane is expected to make landfall along the Carolina coast, and that's going to be sometime Thursday, late in the afternoon and into the evening. A historic situation is what we're going to be talking about. The last one, the most major one that's hit South Carolina, Hurricane Hugo back in 1989. The most recent major hurricane for North Carolina, if that's the situation, is Fran, but also everyone's talking about Hurricane Hazel back in 1954.
Corey?
And landfall still expected well northeast of Jacksonville. Still see some fringe effects, especially with the surf. And at least today, the forecast didn't change a whole lot. Obviously, there will be a lot of new data coming in over the next several hours on Monday and progressing through the rest of the week.
Yeah, and that's going to be very important information. The aircraft data as to exactly where Florence goes, how strong it might be. This could, in the end, be a very damaging storm for especially the Carolinas. Let's go to the maps right now, and we'll show you what we're talking about. This storm will also be expanding as we get into the later into the week, over the next few days. So, and we're already starting to see some evidence of the expanding of this, the girth, if you will, of this hurricane. There it is as a Category 4 hurricane, a really well-developed storm. Quite interesting because middle of last week it suddenly increased to a Category 4 on Wednesday. It then suddenly decreased because of shear and a good deal of dry air in its vicinity. So it was really shredded apart by the weekend, so it took some time to reorganize itself, but boy, it has gotten the job done. Into the west and northwest, conditions are all go, so to speak, for strengthening. Very warm ocean water and pretty low shear as well. And unfortunately, this looks like a major move to the west-northwest as a really intense hurricane. And again, look how it's growing in size, and that's expected to continue as it approaches the coast by late week. And what a well-developed eye. It's just scary to see something like this on the satellite photograph because it immediately reminds you of Irma from last year, Harvey of last year, or dare I say Maria as well, as this hurricane is looking like now. This could be one of the most intense hurricanes to hit the eastern seaboard in a generation, perhaps, with movement to the west-northwest. Now, the official forecast is taking it to 150-mile-an-hour winds. It is quite possible, especially given the strengthening trend today, that this goes Cat 5 at least for a while. And to realize over the western Atlantic, it still has to cross the Gulf Stream, which is really warm water. And then there's the move northwestbound toward the coast, a little bit, I think, either way of Myrtle Beach. It may end up a little south and west of this, though I don't think it's a whole lot. I've always been concerned about Myrtle Beach, which is right in here. And because of the big high pressure, we'll be talking about that over the next few minutes, that's going to be building to the north. That will be the driving force for Florence. And if it expands a little bit or is a little bit stronger than forecast models are indicating right now, this may very well end up being a little bit farther south and west, the ultimate track. And that is later in the day, Thursday into Thursday night, reaching Jacksonville's latitude at about late Wednesday and Wednesday night. But at this point would be hundreds of miles to the east of Jacksonville. This is 11 o'clock Tuesday evening, still the mature, well-developed hurricane, as you can see. And there's 5 o'clock Wednesday afternoon at Jacksonville's latitude, but a long ways to the east. Now, having said that, we still get a strong northeasterly flow in here. There'll be rough seas and surf, very high rip current risk, dangerous rip currents. And then once the hurricane gets far enough north, it's the old switcheroo. The wind starts to come in off of the land. It's an offshore wind. So it's the surfer's delight once that happens later Thursday into Friday, but still very dangerous. Can't emphasize enough, very dangerous rip currents. All the while, we're seeing the Carolinas getting ready for that potentially major hit then later Thursday and Thursday night as the landfall occurs. And it will be a slowing storm at that point, and that has huge ramifications on just how much rain there'll be and the freshwater flooding in addition to the storm surge, of course, and the very high wind impacts at the coast. So here's the Burrish bottom line right right now on Florence. It looks like a Carolina direct hit. Local impacts for Jacksonville, northeast Florida, and southeast Georgia look to be primarily high surf and seas, a very high rip current risk middle of the week through the end of the week. But this is primarily a coastal, a beach, and offshore impact the way it looks from Florence, despite its size and intensity. Always more, of course, at Talking the Tropics with Mike, which I update frequently at actionnewsjax.com, WOKV.com, and our First Alert weather app, which you can download for free. Ariel?
Thanks, Mike. And a lot of the questions that I've been receiving from people around town and even here in the newsroom is what is turning this storm system towards the north? Because without that northerly turn, it does appear that the system is kind of moving in our direction. Well, we have a couple of scenarios, and the first of those, the more likely, is that the system makes that northwesterly turn and kind of makes landfall somewhere close to the North Carolina, South Carolina border. The second option is for the system to move farther towards the north, making more of a landfall out towards the Outer Banks. And third option would be for the system to move more towards the Charleston region through South Carolina. And it all has to do with high pressure out over the Atlantic. This blocking high wraps clockwise. It's kind of going to suck that system off towards the north, and the stronger that high pressure is going to have a real impact on where Florence is headed. So the stronger it is, the farther west the system will turn. We are keeping a close eye on that high pressure, the steering wind for Hurricane Florence. But again, looking most likely that Florence will make its way towards the coastline of the Carolinas, close to the North and South Carolina border as we head into Thursday evening and early into the morning hours on Friday. Next up, with more information on tracking Florence, meteorologist Garrett Biedenbaugh.
Yeah, we have some differences with the different computer models that we've been talking about the past couple of days. We have the GFS versus the Euro, and those are two different reliable global hurricane models as well. Let's go ahead and continue to watch these different scenarios play out here. You can see the GFS is in the purple shade, the Euro is in the yellow shade, and as we put it forward into motion, those will continue marching across the Atlantic Ocean, and pretty much there's good consensus that these are going to be marching closer to the Carolina coast. There's the Euro on 6 a.m. on Thursday, the GFS just a little bit to the right, and as we go forward in time, Thursday evening is when the Euro takes it in right near the southeast North Carolina coast, the North Carolina, South Carolina border. Meanwhile, the GFS takes it closer to the Outer Banks of North Carolina, which would be just a total lashing on that coastline there. And then the Euro kind of sits it in central and the high country of North Carolina, which will be tremendous inland flooding, another threat that we're going to have to watch here for those folks in the Carolinas. But we also have the European ensembles. These are different runs of the European model with some different initializing conditions, and so it pretty much tweaks that main model, and it puts out this output. 51 members here, and they're all clustering closer to the Carolinas. Again, you have one cluster that is in central South Carolina's coast, more in North Carolina's coast, and just a few into portions of southeast Georgia. The ones in Florida you're seeing here would be determined as an outlier for this particular scenario. So the clustering is closer to the Carolinas. But again, Mike, as we continue to talk about the different situations here, it is very volatile. Any movement to the west and southwest would dramatically impact more folks along the Carolina coast.
Right, or even maybe a little bit farther south. Even though we don't think that's the way this goes, it's imperative that everybody from Florida to New England quite literally stays up to date on the latest forecast, and that you're always prepared. We preach it all the time. Don't panic, but prepare. That's the most important information we can give. And with that storm strengthening and still moving west right now, my concern is that it will stay west a little bit longer before it turns northwest, which still should happen, which would keep it east of Jacksonville, but opens up more of the South Carolina coast potentially, or maybe even the upper Georgia coast. So Savannah should be on alert too. The old cork in the stream. We pulled this out last year, built this. Garrett Biedenbaugh built this during Hurricane Irma last year, because we get a lot of questions about what steers hurricanes, what moves them, why is it going to turn? I mean, if you look at that storm right now and it's been moving west for so long, the obvious question is, and we're getting a lot of them, what makes us think it's going to turn? And maybe it won't. And we understand that concern and maybe the fear there too. Again, we don't ever want you to be afraid. We just want you to be prepared. But the cork in the stream means that Florence, like all hurricanes, will follow the path of least resistance. resistance. You saw Ariel talk about it, Garrett's spoken about it, Corey will too, that the driving force of Florence is a big upper-level high-pressure area over the northern part of the Atlantic. So there's an alleyway there that is going to allow Florence to turn to the west-northwest. It's just like a cork in the stream. As it moves along, it's going to meander depending on the curves and the nooks and crannies of that stream or that river. And if a pebble or a rock gets dropped in that stream, it causes a little bit of a ripple effect again, and it causes your cork to move a different direction. And that's how Florence is going to move. And that brick wall of high pressure up here over the northern Atlantic is key. It is critical to exactly when Florence makes that turn, how fast it'll move, because it will accelerate when it gets on that west side of the high pressure area, and then exactly where it goes on the eastern seaboard. So you know all about that cone of uncertainty, right? That area that's expected to have the track of that storm move through. And that's all it is, you guys. The cone of uncertainty is the track forecast and the potential error for that track forecast going out to 5 days. So the probable center location is predicted, although we don't want you to get too caught up with exactly where that center is, because the effects from many hurricanes, and Florence will be no exception, go a long ways away from that center. And this is going to be a big storm. So the winds, the rain, and especially the seas and surf a long ways away from the center. The location is predicted out to 5 days in the future. Storm intensity is predicted at each of these points that you see here on the left-hand side of the screen. The size of that circle is determined by the historical track error. So in other words, when you get to the northern end of that cone, it's going to be wider because the track error is greater, and in fact can be, historically has been, as much as 100 to 150 miles off from what reality was. Now think about that. That's huge for those folks in the Carolinas or anywhere up and down the East Coast. If the forecast right now is 200 plus miles off at day 5, which is possible, folks, it's the weather. There's nothing exact about it. Okay? So you really have to pay attention to where that cone is and not so much the width of it, because it doesn't have anything to do with where the damage is, only the track error, the average track error on the forecast, and it's formed by drawing circles around each of those points, so you get maybe something that looks like this. Again, can't emphasize enough, the cone does not at all indicate the size of the storm. It does not indicate at all where there may be damage. And the storm center generally remains in that track 2/3 of the time. That has been the historical accuracy of the cone. So now, right now, that cone pointed toward the Carolinas, again, has nothing to do with where the storm, it may do damage. It has everything to do with where the storm's expected to go and the track error, most importantly, on average for a hurricane. And realize that the center is not all that important. That's why we don't emphasize it in the First Alert Weather Center, because the damage, the danger from a hurricane can and oftentimes does extend far away from the eye of the hurricane. Corey, there have been Hurricane Hunter aircraft out and about in Florence for several days now, and will really start picking up the frequency, as well as research aircraft, hopefully helping to narrow this cone and more accurate forecasts ultimately.
And it was actually those hurricane hunters that gave us the information that upgraded Florence to a Category 4. It was a special statement from the Hurricane Center, because we had an 11 a.m. update on Monday, and at noon they came right around and made it a Category 4 hurricane, bumping it up one level. And this was the actual track of the plane. You can see it really zigzagging there in the middle. And all the numbers you see here, this is at flight level. So there has to be some interpretation done as to what's going on at the ground. You see the pressure, you see the wind speed, and again, there is the track there, the plane zigzagging through. Chief Meteorologist Mike Burrish, he just hit on it. Meteorology, there is nothing exact about it. A lot of our measurements that we use, including radar, First Alert Doppler HD, satellite, what you're looking at here, these are what we call remote sensors. Remote meaning it's from a different place. We're using an instrument in one location that is detecting something in another location. And that's not always the most accurate representation of what's going on. So that's why we send a plane into the hurricane to actually get measurements on site. We call that in situ, or on site, on location, where it is actually happening itself. Now, of course, we have satellite and radar, and they give us beautiful interpretations of what is actually going on with the storm. And again, this is Florence at its Category 4 strength, winds 130 miles per hour, and that movement to the west at about 14. And of course, a lot of satellite photos on social media that we have been sharing on Action News Jack's Twitter and on all of our Twitter and Facebook pages, which you can follow us there as well. For more about the wind probabilities as it moves closer to the coast, we're going to send it over to Ariel.
And as the system makes its way closer to the coastline of the Carolinas, we'll start to see, of course, wind, waves, and rain picking up along those coastlines. So this is going to show you the probability or the likelihood of when we start to see the tropical storm force winds greater than 40 miles per hour reaching the coast. So we'll take it forward in time. Again, this is a Category 4 strength hurricane making its way towards the coast of the Carolinas. We have about a 50% chance of seeing Morehead City with tropical storm force winds reaching the coast there by 7 o'clock in the morning on Thursday. So that's early in the day. The likelihood of those winds at tropical storm force there in Morehead City closer to 100% by 7 p.m. on Thursday. And you have about a 70% chance of those tropical storm force winds there in Myrtle Beach at the same time. Even Raleigh starting to see closer to a 35% chance of those 40 mile per hour tropical storm force winds again on Thursday evening. Then those probabilities increase, of course, as the storm works its way inland. Raleigh looking at about an 80% chance of tropical storm force winds by 1 o'clock, even into Saturday, with the system still trying to make its way inland. So those winds are going to stick around. This is a closer look again at your tropical storm force wind probability, close to 80% there in Morehead City. This is at noon on Thursday, and Wilmington starting to see that potential closer to 50 to 60%. Same for you or folks there in Myrtle Beach, again by noon Thursday. And the likelihood just increases as the storm makes its way closer to shore. This is at 9 p.m. on Thursday evening. And then Friday morning, very strong winds all along the coast there of North Carolina and then stretching down to Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. Now this is going to show you the probability of seeing hurricane force winds as the storm makes its way closer to the coast. So getting closer to about a 50% chance of winds upwards of 74 miles per hour. This is at 9 p.m. on Thursday. And again, the system moving farther inland, we'll start to see the potential for a 30% chance of hurricane force winds there, Myrtle Beach, and that's into Friday. Again, another look at your hurricane force wind probability. Morehead City, about a 50% chance. Same for Wilmington, 45 to 50% chance by Friday morning. Myrtle Beach also seeing the potential for those hurricane force winds as the system makes its way onshore. So we talked about winds increasing into the end of the week with the approaching storm. We're also going to see the potential for a lot of heavy rainfall, flooding rain along the coast of the Carolinas. And to show you more on that, meteorologist Garrett Biedenbach.
Yeah, this is really going to be a heavy rainmaker as well. The rainfall forecast is just going to continue to go up here over the next 5+ days or so. We're going to see over a foot of rain likely in many locations. You can see this bullseye there closer to the southeast North Carolina coast there. That's just to the north of Wilmington, approaching the Outer Banks of North Carolina and then up through the Raleigh-Durham area. This is going to expand depending on the exact track. It's kind of critical where exactly Florence goes to determine how much rainfall, in fact, falls over the Carolinas. But you can see the western side, so the upstate of South Carolina, will likely see less rainfall in the current track scenario there. But you can see also 10 to plus and 12+ inches of rain is just extraordinary. And this could shift to the west if the track does as well. So the metropolitan area of Charlotte up through Winston-Salem, up through the mountains of North Carolina there, really going to be seeing some heavy rains, some flooding rains inland as well. So not just a coastal event with the storm surge and the high winds associated with the tropical system. We're also going to see those deep tropical raindrops falling over portions of Virginia down through Norfolk. They're already sending the ships out at the naval base there in Norfolk, sorting out, and also Raleigh, Durham, also back into Fayetteville, North Carolina. A lot of heavy rainfall. Also, what we're actually going to see some local impacts from the waves, and here's the wave forecast here with this current track scenario as well. Again, it could change if the track changes, but we're going to see 5 to 9 footers offshore. So basically by Wednesday, Monday. If you're a small boat, if you have a small boat, you don't want to be going offshore at all. The waves are just going to be too high. And then, of course, you're going to have 40-plus footers offshore there from the Outer Banks of North Carolina, closer to the east side of what is Florence there. So waves already beginning to increase, the swells increasing as well here along our coast. The high rip current risks continue to increase here across northeast Florida and southeast Georgia. So, Mike, the bottom line is we got some heavy rain to north of us and some waves here locally.
Exactly. It will be amazing, I think, to people who are on what we call the subsidence side of the storm, the west side, the southwest side of the hurricane, when it's especially at a distance, about how relatively tranquil and actually pretty nice it is. All the while, a violent hurricane is making landfall somewhere on the upper eastern seaboard, upper compared to Jacksonville, probably the Carolinas, the way it looks. There's the eye of the hurricane. By the way, I will point out just real quickly, the tropics are very active. Besides Florence, we have a wave over the northwestern Caribbean that has the potential to develop as it heads into the Gulf of Mexico. That would appear to be primarily a western Gulf of Mexico concern and potentially eventually Texas. This is Isaac, which is a hurricane moving westbound. Indications are it will encounter a good deal of shear, and with any luck that breaks it up some at least before it gets to the Lesser Antilles, which of course are still trying to recover from last year's hurricane season and Irma. And then way off to the east is Hurricane Helene, which may maintain hurricane strength into next week. But the good news is on that one, it would kind of be out in the middle of nowhere over the eastern Atlantic. So again, here's the Burrish bottom line, the First Alert Weather Center bottom line, and how it looks like it's going to go down over the next several days. As of right now, headed for the Carolinas. We don't see a whole lot of change in that at this point, but there will likely be at least some fluctuations in exactly where this storm goes and makes landfall, but we don't want to get too caught up in the exact center anyway, because the effects and the impacts will go long range away from the eye. Local impacts in Jacksonville and northeastern portions of Florida and southeast Georgia will be beaches and the ocean. So Garrett mentioned earlier, everyone owning a small boat should stay in port middle and end of the week. Best advice is to not go in the water. We know that surfers are going to do so anyway. So the best advice is to always swim and surf with a buddy and as near a lifeguard as at all possible. There'll be a very dangerous rip current risk. We are updating Talking the Tropics with Mike and all of our web stuff and app stuff, which is great hurricane information round the clock. And we're tracking and talking about all of these storms. It's not just Florence. We also have, as I mentioned, Isaac, Helene, and probably something trying to develop in the western Gulf. In the meantime, a little bit of historical perspective. This part of the nation, the Carolinas, certainly not immune from big hurricanes, big storms. But Corey, this one may rival some of the biggest.
Right now, or on Monday, as we're recording this and streaming this, Florence is basically the same strength as Hugo and back in 1898. Now, those were when they made landfall.
Right.
Obviously, Florence still well out to sea. A lot can change, a lot can weaken, a lot can also strengthen by the time it actually makes its way to the shore.
I might mention Hurricane Hugo, I remember very well. I know you guys don't. You're just a little bit younger than me. But Hugo, I was actually landlocked in Des Moines, Iowa at WHO-TV. Early morning, I was pretty fresh out of college and was doing the early morning show, newscast, and the storm hit overnight and in the early morning hours on the coast of South Carolina, upper coast of South Carolina and parts of North Carolina ravaged. Well, initially, we didn't have cell towers obviously back then. All we had was phone service and electricity, of course, which was all gone in the Carolinas. Initially, it took a couple of hours, actually several hours, at least to sunrise, before anybody realized how devastating it was. We thought it was bad, but we were getting no reports. So we were kind of thinking, well, maybe a lot of people in the country are thinking maybe we got off a little lucky. And then the reports started to file in, and we started to get some aerial reports, and it was a real disaster. This is a nasty looking setup and situation for the Carolinas, something, Ariel, that people should take very seriously all up and down the coast, but particularly the Carolinas.
Absolutely, especially if you have family and friends there. Make sure that they're doing what we tell you to do here locally when we have our own storms, which is know your evacuation zone, have a plan for you and your family and of course your pets. And you can download our free Action News Jax First Alert Weather app. It has all of the tracks, so as those come in, you'll get that live update on your smartphone or on your tablet, and you can also get it on our website.
Garrett, this is kind of your old stomping grounds a little bit, fortunately and unfortunately. Fortunately, because you know it well. unfortunately, because you know what's going to happen the way it looks potentially this week. Do you have some perspective?
Yeah, the Carolinas, you know, they've been through Hugo. I've actually seen the high water marks from Hugo in Folly Beach, South Carolina, which is to the south of the actual landfall near McClellanville. McClellanville has a pretty violent history of landfalls where it is in South Carolina's coastline. And this is under the threat as well if it were to shift back to the south and west. But it looks like to the north, closer to Myrtle Beach into North Carolina, this is going to, of course, change the way that those locations look potentially, especially on the northeast side of the eye wall, which is typically the most intense portion of a hurricane. Plus you add the storm surge flooding, the waves on top of those 10 plus feet of storm surge. It is going to be devastating to those spots that are already beginning to take it very seriously, and hopefully continue to make those important and life-saving decisions by local folks there.
It should be taken very seriously. We hope for the best, but we plan and prepare for the worst. Ariel was showing the graphic. It occurred to me a few minutes ago about the percentages and the chances of tropical storm and hurricane force winds. We want to emphasize those percentages. In some cases, they look relatively small, but realize that on any given day, 95% of the time or more, the percentage chance of having those kinds of winds is 0.
Right.
So any percentage is significant. And then finally, if you're headed north on Interstate 95 or have plans to do so anytime this week, you have business or other plans, the best advice really, besides stay up to date on the forecast obviously, is probably to make some new plans, some changes to your plans. And the best advice would be to stay out of this area that looks like it could be hit very hard. Our own local Jacksonville Salvation Army already will be heading up I-95 here very soon to start to offer some aid, early aid and help, and then be in place for when and if they need to clean up. So on behalf of Garrett Beatonbaugh, Ariel Nixon, and Corey Sima, I'm Chief Meteorologist Mike Burrish. This has been a very special First Alert update on Hurricane Florence, a potential devastating blow to the eastern seaboard. We'll keep you updated round the clock at ActionNewsJax.com. You can download for free our First Alert weather app, and of course on the TV side, CBS 47 and Fox 30 Action News Jax, and on the radio, News 104.5 WOKV. Take care, everybody.